Ja, welcome again to Science and Democracy, Wetenskap og Demokratie. And this week, our topic is epistemic injustice. And what we'll do is try to explain what epistemic injustice is, what this concept, it's a new concept, refers to, although the phenomena it describes are probably old. And then we'll also try to link it a little bit to what we've talked about last week. We asked the question, which experts should we trust? So epistemic injustice, as Fricker defines it in the paper that you've read, which is a short version of a whole book that she has written with that title, is when we wrong someone in their capacity as a knower. Now that's not obvious to understand, so we'll try to explain the phenomenon. Okay. And so I want to return to last week. So there we learned about how we epistemically depend on others. That idea of epistemic autonomy, where we completely independent of others and build oral knowledge from first-hand experience, isn't really attainable and arguably isn't even an ideal. In a well-functioning community, we collaborate when it comes to gaining knowledge. There's epistemic distribution of labor. And much of what we then know comes from hearing, seeing, or reading what others have to say. That happens in the informal context. We learn about various things from our friends, through our family, but it also happens in institutionalized context. We learn by reading newspapers, by going to university, by reading various books, articles, watching television, browsing the internet, YouTube, and various more specific institutions that exist. Okay. So these collaborations, this knowing, getting to know things from others, are sort of at the backbone of our society. And without that, a society couldn't really work at all. And much of what we as individuals know and what society as a whole knows comes from that complex network of seeing, hearing, and reading what others have to say. So here is a very small part of that network of exchanging information in a society. So what Fricker describes as the credibility economy is about how we assign trust or credibility, that is, how believable is it what someone is saying in this complex network. So it's not really the case that everyone is equal in how much of a say they get in that exchange of seeing, hearing, and so on, what others have to say. Some people have a very elevated position. Their voices get heard a lot. What they have to say gets listened to a lot. And often people pay a lot of attention to them, but they also tend to view them as credible. Okay. So here's a person that gets a lot of attention, and for some parts of the population, he also gets a lot of credibility because he is a self-made man. It's not true, but many people think. Maybe because they think he's one of us, he has the right values. For whatever reason, people assign credibility to him. It happens also in the more academic parts. Jordan Peterson's book gets a lot of attention. People view it as quite credible, and it has a very elevated position in the market of sort of broadly psychological sort of self-help writings. Okay? And that's true also in Norway. It's translated into different languages. That's already not true for many other books in the same category. And of course, I mean, we don't need to talk about cases like those where someone really doesn't deserve that. Sometimes people really do deserve an elevated position, get their voice heard a lot. Like Stoltenberg, who in her position has a lot of say about various things. And she gets heard not just by the general public, by politicians who need to make decisions about how to handle this current pandemic. Okay. It happens not only in those cases, there's also influencers of various forms that have a lot of things to say about, for example, how to dress, what hair to wear. They have an influence aware of which forms of self-expression are acceptable, which forms are not, what is cool, what is in fashion. Some people have a very elevated position in this. Okay. So some people in the credibility economy have a very powerful position. Okay. By contrast, some people, these are very small arrows here, some people have almost no voice at all. When they are trying to say something, they're assigned very little credibility. They're not listened to. Maybe they're not paid attention to. Mansplaining is one example that is good to mention. So something that many of you probably have experienced before, certainly in philosophy is quite common, that there's a room full of students, and there are a number of usually men who talk a lot and who explain something to someone else. And sometimes those other people, women often, they actually know a lot more. And when we, for example, read the essays, we know, well, actually, they're a lot better students. But there's always the man who tries to explain everything. I wouldn't exclude that I'm also sometimes guilty of that myself. Okay. So that's an issue where some people have they're assigned a lot of credibility. Some people get assigned lower credibility than what they deserve. That's a kind of like the equivalent in the exchange of information about someone taking too much space. So in this credibility economy, there are inequalities. Some people's voices get amplified, whereas other people's voices get muted. Some people are attributed a lot of credibility, whereas other people are attributed only very little credibility. Some people have a hard time have an easy time voicing their view. They're always listened to, after all. Whereas other people find it close to impossible to voice their opinions. So the inequalities are not this credibility economy where we attribute trust to something that someone says is not equal. Now, in order to come to know or believe something on the basis of what they say, we have to take their utterance, that is what they say, to be credible or believable enough. If we, for example, think that someone isn't credible at all because they are just making things up, then we can't come to know on the basis of what they say anything, because we'll just push it to the side. The problem is that how much credibility we give to someone's utterance is something that can go wrong. It can be inflated, as I've tried to show with some examples, or it can be deflated, give people too little credibility. The mansplaining case was the first example, and we're gonna get a lot to more about this. Now, it's not, so let me emphasize, that, so what Fricker then calls testimonial injustice is when we wrong someone in their testimonial capacity, in the capacity as someone who gives testimony, that is, someone who tells us about something, by unfairly or in inappropriate ways deflating their credibility. So they have a certain credibility, but we don't take them to be credible enough. Okay, and then we wrong them. So part of this is an epistemic dysfunction. Okay, we don't come to know what we otherwise could have known. Someone tells us something, we're not listening, but they know about it, then we'll not come to know what we could have otherwise known. So we are epistemically worse off, okay, because we don't make use of, say, the expertise of someone, since we are systematically disregarding what they have to say. But it's not only an epistemic problem. So this is it's also an ethical problem. We're mistreating or wronging that person because we don't let them participate in that exchange of knowledge or information. So at the beginning, in the first few lectures, we talked about knowledge and evidence. We talked about science and its place, science and how it works. Then we had a few sessions where we talked about democracy and justice and what constitutes the state's authority and so on. Now we're going to connect these ethical and political questions with these epistemological questions in the next couple of sessions. And today is sort of the first one where we do that. We're thinking about epistemic injustice, and now we're talking particularly about testimonial injustice. It has a side that's to do with the exchange of knowledge and information, but it also has an ethical and political side. Now note, just giving one person's utterance more credibility than someone else's utterance about some topic is not itself an epistemic or a testimonial injustice to the person. So if you, for example, would give more credibility to what Stoltenberg says about how to handle pandemics than to give to me, that isn't unfair to me, because I do in fact have less credibility about those matters than she has, since I don't know much about it. And that is something you can know, since she has certain position. So the idea is not that we are wronging someone by giving them less credibility than someone else. The idea is that we're giving them less credibility than the credibility they deserve. So in the case I just mentioned, I do in fact deserve less credibility, but in some other cases, where someone's silenced, their views are not heard, they are given less credibility than what they in fact deserve. Now note that even here, there can be fairly innocent versions. So for example, I tell you that I took out the garbage. We live together in a house, say. But you distracted and didn't even listen to what I said. So you don't take me very credible, and you don't come to believe that the garbage has been taken out. Now, I deserve more credibility than that. because it is part of a communal life. But arguably, this is not a very deep injustice to me that I wasn't listened to on this topic. The injustice happens when someone is systematically and continuously, in many circumstances, given less credibility than they deserve. Now, as I've mentioned with some example at the beginning, there is another dysfunction that can happen, namely that someone systematically gets more credibility than they deserve. Now, I think that's not itself an injustice against that person. I mean, you're not in Trump by being given more credibility than he deserves there's no injustice in that. Although it leads to epistemic problems, because then a lot of people will come to believe what Trump thinks, even though he doesn't have credibility. So that is an epistemic problem. But so far, it's not yet, I don't think, an ethical problem, okay? Because you're not wronging Trump or not really wronging someone else. But of course, there can be symptoms of an injustice, which is because the inflation of someone's credibility usually comes with another side, namely the deflation of other people who deserve at least as much or indeed more credibility. Okay, that need not happen, but in many cases it does happen. And these mechanisms of attention that can be played are particularly important here. That one way we can come to give someone less credibility than reserve is just not even paying attention to them. Okay, so that's something I'm very interested in, so I mentioned this here. Okay, so now let's talk about this deflated credibility. So deflating someone's credibility to less than what they deserve can be localized or it can be very pervasive. So it can happen in some situations or some contexts or in many different ones. So it might, for example, happen in the classroom that the voice of a female student, isn't heard. In some classrooms, for example, with a male teacher and a lot of male students, but it might not happen in other classrooms with a lot of female students. So it might be context dependent how much credibility some people get. It might happen in some particular circumstance. It might happen in the classroom, but it might not happen in some other settings. So one thing that I, for example, found interesting when I had a child, that as a man, one is used to being given a lot of credibility in a lot of parts of life. But then when it comes, for example, at least where my child grew up in Germany, where when you go to the playground or do things with a small infant, a baby, then as a man, one is given less credibility than arguably what you deserve. Okay, maybe I deserve very little, but I felt certainly that I wasn't listened to. Okay, so it can be localized like that. Can happen sometimes, can all the time. It can happen to just a particular person, or it can happen only by some people that they don't listen to you, or it can happen by lots of people, or it can happen by some particular people. For example, if your teacher doesn't listen to you, that they have power over you, then that's particularly problematic if they don't give you credibility. And it can happen to a particular person just like that. Or it can happen to a certain group of people, since they recognize, and particulars in that group, because they're recognized as someone coming from that group. So Fricker holds that a specifically problematic and pervasive injustice occurs when a specific group of people is systematically given less credibility than they deserve, because other people have a prejudice against people of that group. So, for example, if you have the prejudice that women aren't very good at philosophy, for example, because you haven't read any of the women philosophers' writings of the past, then you might give women's views about philosophy less credibility than they deserve, for example, in a classroom. If you have a black prejudice that black people are stupid, then colored people, in their views, will be given less credibility than they deserve. And that might happen in many circumstances. Now, you might have asked, so what is the right level of credibility? What's the level that someone deserves? There is actually, I think, one way of looking at it, which is not very moral at all, which is just to think it's a matter of reliability. What is the chance that what someone says is informative, true, well thought through on a topic? And you might think that giving them less credibility than they deserve if that person is in fact a reliable witness on these topics. So then you're excluding them in you're epistemically making a mistake. So there's also interesting questions whether you can, is it sometimes they might not be reliable, but you still should have given them credibility. Now, we're going to now actually talk a little bit about that issue where you, where someone might be, in a certain sense, not reliable or confused or show signs of misunderstanding, and therefore they're given less credibility. And that can happen, but that can happen in a way that's already a sign of an injustice. And that is connected to this other epistemic injustice. So this is, so far we've talked about a person who tries to tell something to someone, but they don't assign a lot of credibility to that person, and therefore that person, so the person in the middle here, is not listened to, and they cannot spread knowledge that they in fact have. Okay, so that's testimonial injustice. But there's another kind of injustice that Fricker talks about, and that's what happens when a person who has various experiences in her society don't find the words, the tools, the ways of thinking that would be useful to interpreting what she's experiencing in the world. So what she is saying might then be confused or might not be easy to understand, and she might never even talk about it because she doesn't have ways of conceptualizing it, ways of thinking about it, ways of expressing it. Okay. And so that is hermeneutic injustice, where a person is not given tools for interpreting a relevant part of the world. You're doing an injustice to them too, because it's another form of epistemic injustice, because they cannot participate in the exchange of knowledge because they're not given tools to understand a certain part of the world. So the example that Fricker mentions in the brief article that you have read is the experience of gay people for big parts of history. There were no tools to describe what's happening to them. There were no tools for a gay man, say, to say come out, because there was no term that described coming out. Indeed, these just even being in love with someone of your gender wasn't possible in a sense, because love was defined as between a man and a woman. It's not so many of the things that you may have experienced, you weren't able to talk about, think about. So this is Alan Turing, who is the famous mathematician who suffered greatly both this kind of hermeneutic injustice that probably wasn't able to express himself in the 1950s about this, but then also, of course, he was actually basically killed because he was a gay man in the 50s. Okay, so here it's the idea is that people can be in a situation where they can't make sense of their experiences, since there aren't fitting ways of describing them available in their society. Other examples that are well known are, for example, the case of the term sexual harassment. That's a fairly new term, that there could be sexual harassment happening in a university, in a workplace, and so on. Now, if you didn't have that concept, then it may seem like you don't understand what's happening. Someone seems to, is this flirtation? Is this, what's wrong with that? There's just no terminology, no way of thinking about what is happening to you when you're sexually harassed, if that terminology doesn't exist. So you can't describe your experiences, and you might be confused. You might not talk ever about it because there's no word to talk about it. Mansplaining is a more recent example of that, where something can happen that a man explains something to a woman, even though the woman already knows, and he could easily know that she already knows that. Mansplaining is a new term that picks that up. A beautiful example, fairly recent, is by Kate Manne, a fantastic philosopher, feminist philosopher, who has coined this term himpathy. So that's the term that describes the phenomenon where a man is given more sympathy than they deserve because they are men. And she observes correctly that that's happening a lot, that people tend to have a lot of himpathy. So what I would like to invite you at this point is think about your own examples. That is, examples where certain kinds of experiences you may have had, maybe you find it hard to express because there aren't words, but maybe there are no, maybe there are system aspects of, some aspects of the world might be systematic, not word. These worlds might be systematically overlooked, misinterpreted, distorted, not studied academically. That can also happen. That something exists, but there are no academic words for it. Because it's not studied in academia. So every time you talk about it, you sound stupid because it's not the kind of thing that is discussed in the university. Okay. Think about examples from your life, or think about examples that in history or in society that are well described by this hermeneutic injustice term, where someone is excluded from the exchange of knowledge because they're not given the representational tools to make sense of their experience. Now, Fricker has a particular way of thinking that's very virtue theoretic for how to correct epistemic injustice. She thinks that it's an important way to correct them through particular virtues called virtues of testimonial and hermeneutic justice, where the virtue of testimonial justice will correct for the influence of prejudice on credibility assignments. So someone is influenced by prejudice in how much credibility assigned to someone. If you have this virtue, you'll correct for that. Hermeneutic justice will correct for lack of conceptual resources. For example, invite people to talk slowly about their experiences, giving them a forum for develop their ideas, extend the number of things that are studied academically so that the words will be studied. Give the Research Council of Norway might give money to that. I have actually a colleague who's working on these things, so very much studied phenomenon. Okay, this is the first part of the lecture. We'll get to more complexities in the credibility economy in the second part.